Oil giants Shell and Total are reporting record profits totaling nearly $20 billion. They are benefiting from partly stoked high energy prices due to Russia's war in the Ukraine. We saw supply get constrained. We saw, the price for a barrel of oil go up. And if you're going to increase prices to account for additional costs because of constrained supply, you've got to increase production or what have you, you would be seeing the same kind of revenue streams if you're just raising prices to account for those additional costs. But they're experiencing record profits, which tells us they have raised prices for far more than is necessary. They are price gouging in a time of crisis. So London-based Shell reported earnings of $9.45 billion for the third quarter, its second highest profit on record. On the same day, Paris-based Total Energies reported a profit of $9.9 billion. For both companies, the profits were more than double what they earned in the same period 1 year ago. Shell is returning a large chunk of the bounty to shareholders. It planned to increase its dividend to shareholders for the fourth quarter by 15%. Which is about 29 cents a share. The company also pledged to buy back $4 billion worth of its shares, bringing total buybacks announced this year to $18.5 billion, or 10% of the company's share capital. Shell's share price jumped 4.5% in trading in London on Thursday. Total, which had been hit by a strike by refinery workers in France, also said that it would reward all employees worldwide with a bonus equivalent to 1 month's salary. The share price rose nearly 3%. So both are major players in liquefied natural gas, especially now with this enormous demand to replace Russian gas with Russia being sanctioned. So prices have soared. But these companies are really taking advantage of this situation by having these record profits. And we were in a situation where they should have increased production, but instead they thought of the shareholders. They thought about prolonging the extraction of their oil reserves so they can continue to profit quarter after quarter and make shareholders money at the expense of everybody who relies on gas and oil for their energy and to fuel up their cars to go to work. This is not a business that is run with the interests of consumers in mind. The people who can hardly afford to pay their bills is the consequence of these shareholders getting richer and richer. But funnily enough, we've got reporting some of Total's LNG comes from a Russian project called Yamal. Total also owns nearly 20% stake in a Russian gas company called Novatek, Yamal's main owner. Total said it was writing down the value of its Russian businesses by $3.1 billion, leaving $6.1 billion in Russian assets. Meanwhile, Shell said it has not been obligated to pay the windfall tax on oil and gas profits enacted earlier this year by the government. The tax allows companies to deduct capital expenditures. Shell has not paid yet because its capital expenditure on oil and gas projects in the British North Sea reduced profits. So let's look at this guy. This is Ben van Beurden, Shell's chief executive, said he accepted that higher taxes might be placed on oil companies to partly finance programs that help vulnerable people pay their energy bills, which are soaring in the UK. He said, quote, "I think we should be prepared and accept that our industry will be looked at for raising taxes in order to fund the transfers to those who need it most." Last month, it was announced that Van Beurden would step down at the end of the year. I'm sure the shareholders were not too happy about that. Now, returning to stateside, we've got some relevant reporting from Ken Klippenstein with The Intercept. So let's talk about the Federal Reserve for a second, which I love talking about. The Federal Reserve has come under scrutiny in recent months for its aggressive interest rate hikes designed to, as Chairman Jerome Powell said, get wages down and then get inflation down. The Fed's own research has warned that its aggressive policy mirrors a similar one that caused a severe recession under Paul Volcker in the 1980s. Even the United Nations, which recently warned that the Fed's rate hikes risk inflicting worse damage than the financial crisis in 2008 and the COVID shock in 2020. So besides managing monetary policy in the United States, the Federal Reserve is also tasked with regulating banks. The intense lobbying the Fed is subjected to is targeted at these banking regulations. Just to take one example, the Chamber of Commerce, the main business lobby in the United States, reported lobbying on Powell's nomination along with Federal Reserve regulatory reform. In other words, deregulation. Powell was known to favor as part of its $15.39 million in lobbying activities in the first quarter of 2018. The Fed under Powell would go on to water down key elements of Dodd-Frank banking regulations passed in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. In 2022 alone, over 120 groups reported lobbying the Fed on issues ranging from credit card fees to cryptocurrency to sprawling monetary policy initiatives such as mortgage finance. US banks saw their profits rise 7.8% in the second quarter of 2022 because of the rate hikes, though profits were still down year over year. And I know for a lot of people who are not super familiar with how the Fed makes monetary policy, it's operating on false pretenses, models that have not been proven. This idea that if you increase interest rates, there will be less investment in businesses, less businesses will grow, or they won't grow as much, less people will start businesses because it's expensive to borrow money and get that initial funding. Therefore, there will be less jobs, more people will be competing for jobs, and wages can be reduced because workers will be willing to take jobs for lower wages because they'll be so desperate for work. That also benefits corporations who don't want to pay workers higher wages. So we're benefiting the banks, we're benefiting corporations, and we're telling the story that we have to do this to bring inflation down. And you should agree with us, because don't you hate paying high prices? But really what's going on behind the scenes is rich people are making themselves richer again in America. Ravana?
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of news coverage, media coverage of the rising inflation crisis, of the rising price of gas, and they, often blame different entities. They'll blame Joe Biden, they'll blame the war in Russia, they'll blame Putin specifically. If you're watching Fox News, they might blame Zelensky, and some of those definitely do share in the blame for the inflation crisis and for rising gas prices. But what I never see them call out, and who I never see them put the blame on, are the oil and gas corporations who have been making massive profits during this time, rolling around, swimming in Scrooge McDuck style piles of money in their homes, while average working class Americans are wondering how they're going to be able to put gas in their car to get to work. Well, there are people in the UK who aren't turning the heat on in their homes because it's too cold. I read an article about a man who has been sitting in his car during the daytime because he says that the way the sun beats down on his windshield, it's actually warmer for him to be in his car than inside of his house. This is an 80-year-old man. I mean, people are freezing to death inside their own homes because they can't afford their electricity bill because it's powered by oil and gas, and they've been jacking up the prices. And I think it's time that, and I don't expect corporate media to do it, but it's time to start calling out these corporations who are profiting off of the workers' sufferings. It's horrendous what's happening. We live in a country that doesn't have a fantastic public infrastructure in most parts of the country, especially if you're not in an urban area. People really rely on their vehicles, and if they can't put gas in their cars, they can't get to work. So not even just having to pay higher gas prices, this really does impede their ability to make a living for themselves and provide for themselves. So it goes so much deeper, and we really can point at these oil and gas companies and their corporate greed and how they've been lining their pockets off our suffering as a major cause of this. And it's a perfect opportunity to highlight that. And it's been really sad to see these media companies and these news organizations drop the ball on that.
Yeah, absolutely. You had Fox News running programming on how, we've got to increase domestic production. The real reason we weren't increasing domestic production is because they didn't want to cut into their revenue and returns to shareholders by building new rigs and drilling new wells. All they think about is shareholders and profits, and they could be reinvesting their revenue in clean energy because the product they're selling emits carbon, which is destroying our planet. We could go on and on about this.